Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're enjoying this incredible conference. And today's session is going to be a welcome, refreshing change and very much aligned with this vision of modernizing clinical trials. This is a project that we just launched in our Critical Path for Parkinson's. And I'm so proud of this initiative. Today we witnessed the 10-year anniversary of CPP, Critical Path for Parkinson's. And we have had such an incredible journey that links all 5 core competencies of the things you've heard about at this conference so much. Data-driven research, the voice of the patient, how do we do things in alignment with regulatory innovation in such exciting ways for a disease that is so hugely, highly unmet. And we're so joyed and to have women living with Parkinson's joining us today to be our inspiration. So today I'm honored to introduce just distinguished, esteemed leaders that I've had a joy to work with for the 10 years that I've been in this role. And today's speakers will be hearing from Dr. Carly Tanner, who was quoted in this week's New York Times, Katie Kopil of the Michael J. Fox Foundation, Soania Mathur, living with Parkinson's, and my friend and colleague for many years, Derek Hill. So the topic we're going to discuss today has been invisible for far too long. Women represent a large population of those with Parkinson's, but for the 30 years I've worked on Parkinson's, every conference I went to showed the same cartoon image of an old man hunched over. But that's changing. And I want to acknowledge FDA up front for launching the first ever sex differences guidance on study of sex differences in the clinical evaluation of medical products. And this sets the table very similar to what happened in patient-focused drug development. So today, I'm mostly inspired by women living with Parkinson's, many of who we have here with us today. We officially launched this effort in Vienna, Austria at the end of March to really recognize the unmet needs of women living with Parkinson's. And you're going to hear more about that today from this distinguished panel. This is such an important and timely topic where we really need to come together around women's health and try to understand how can we develop therapies that really are linked to the lived experience of women. I'm so honored to introduce my friend and colleague, Carly Tanner, who's joining us today. And she is the world leader in Parkinson's research for so long. And she's going to tell us today around some of the gaps that we have not paid attention to in far too long. Carly.
Great. Thank you very much. Excuse me, you can hear me? Yeah, good. Okay. So this is going to be a little bit of a gallop because Diane asked me, first of all, to these are my disclosures. And so the focus will be women and Parkinson's disease with the big background being that women are underrepresented in most PD research studies. So really important for us to think about that. But I'm going to start with just a little context for what is Parkinson's in case that is not familiar to everyone in the audience. And be very high level. You can ask me more about it later, so apologies already. But not sure if you can make out this diagram, but left is sort of the beginning and right is, progression of time. And what the little bubbles are showing are different features that are associated with Parkinson's disease, with the vertical lines being where would the diagnosis really begin. And the point of this is that Parkinson's is very heterogeneous. It has lots of different features, and they're not the same in everybody. Recently, if you were here in our last session, we've understood that there is a particular protein abnormality that is commonly found. So in more than 90% of people in our clinics who have this abnormality of a protein called alpha-synuclein, which is misfolded, the old-fashioned looking at the brains after people have passed away, Lewy bodies or Lewy bodies, they have a lot of alpha-synuclein in them. So this is a characteristic that gives us some clues and is common in many forms of Parkinsonism. That said, there are genetic forms that are less common and may not always have alpha-synuclein. So even there, you can see some differences and some dissimilarities. But the classic Parkinsonism is a motor syndrome of slowness, rigidity or stiffness, gait and balance disorder, and a classical tremor at rest, so when you're not using the affected body part of tremor. That's classical Parkinsonism, and the classical treatment is to affect the area that's been injured, which is called the dopaminergic system, by replacing it. And so that's been true for since the late 60s, early 70s. That's been the center of our therapy. We don't have a disease-modifying therapy. We're working hard to develop one, and maybe one is coming our way. But that's where we stand with Parkinson's really big picture. Happy to answer more questions. A few things relevant to thinking about women and Parkinson's, and I had a lot more slides, and we had to cut them a lot, but some of them are still being distributed. So one big statement is that if you look at the number of new cases of Parkinson in the population, or if you look at the number of existing cases of Parkinson's in the population, what you find is that there are more men than women, and this difference persists over the lifetime. So Parkinson's classically begins, say, maybe around 50, and then keeps going, and is increasingly common with increasing age. In a lot of diseases that are primarily mediated by female sex hormones, women can be relatively protected, and then after menopause, you see that gap coming together. If you look at that slide there, you'll see the gap stays apart. So there's more going on here. We don't know what it is. It could be behavior, it could be biology, it could be differences in access to care, it could be differences in how women get diagnosed, maybe because of their clinical presentation. It's probably some of all of those things, but a gap that we need to study. This is a recent example looking at a genetic form of Parkinsonism related to a pathogenic variant in a gene called LRRK2. This is present in about 1.5% to 2% of people in the US, but very common in certain populations, Eastern European, Ashkenazi Jew, North African. So in Israel, it might be as many as 40% of the people in their clinic. And it's also interesting because it has what we call reduced penetrance. So you can have the variant, but you may never get Parkinson's. The other thing that's interesting is, in contrast to what I just showed you, that more men than women have Parkinson's, in LRRK2, it looks like it may be the opposite, and more women than men may be, or at least it's equal, but in studies where we've systematically looked, it looks like women who have the mutation are a little bit more likely to develop Parkinsonism than men who have it. So why is that? Again, we don't know. A lot of other things are almost never looked at. So one of my areas, and I have a PhD in epidemiology, we've made a lot of observations based on cohorts that were set up to study like heart disease and cancer. And a lot of those cohorts set up in the 60s and 70s didn't even include women. They were only men. So all the observations about loss of sense of smell or constipation that were made in those cohorts, there were no women in those cohorts. So, so we don't know, right? So these are just some examples. So biologic differences, there are a lot of them, but just some examples: absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion, the way the body, processes drugs or other things you eat or you're exposed to, all differ between women and men. An example is that dopamine system that I said that's so important for therapy for Parkinson's. Different genes are upregulated in the area that's injured in Parkinsonism in women versus men and those dopaminergic neurons. What effect does that have in terms of therapy or response to therapy? That's not really well studied. There are different proportions of the recognition site, the receptor on the next nerve cell down the road that receives the dopamine signal. So D1 is dopamine 1, D2 is dopamine 2 receptors. They differ in proportion between men and women, and that may modify how people respond to therapy. Estradiol, a female sex hormone, may affect all the aspects of how the body processes dopamine. and then many, many functions that are really important in terms of how we respond to things that we eat, things that we're exposed to, toxicants we might be exposed to, drugs we might take, are different between men and women, including things for scientists, autophagy, inflammatory responses, mitochondrial function, lipid or fat metabolism. All of those things differ, and the differences aren't well understood, but they're also generally not incorporated into how we think about drugs or treatments or treatment responses. There are other aspects that are also important. Experiences between men and women can be really different. So this is just summarizing a few studies that have looked at things like the time from the onset of symptoms to the time of diagnosis or to the time of first seeing a movement disorder specialist is longer for women than for men. So less awareness possibly, who knows quite all the reasons for that. Women are less likely to have unpaid care partners, so they're more likely to have to pay for support. And while that wasn't part of this study as a clinician, women are also more likely to have Parkinson's, but themselves still be having responsibilities themselves as carers, which is another important thing that's different than men. Women are less likely in general to visit a physician, to be put into a skilled, more likely to need to be placed in a skilled nursing facility, and in general have shorter survival. So these are all big knowledge gaps. We can observe them in single studies. We don't usually know why, so much more research is needed. And so just a few suggestions, there's much more here we won't talk about, where we can go. First of all, women's voice, involving women in understanding the experience of a person with Parkinson's, in setting research priorities and identifying what's important, involving women in research, being attentive to that, and trying to understand how we can see whether the biologic differences are important and what other factors matter, and then using biologic sex as a key variable when we think about treatment. So I'll stop there and hand it off to my friend and colleague, Soania.
Thank you, Carly. And Carly could have given an entire session of talk on this. You can just see the gaps are so big here. Soania has been an inspiration of one of the people who really inspired this idea of why start a GEMPD initiative. Her publications, her awareness, her advocacy has really brought light to something that was hidden for far too long. We're thrilled to have you here.
Thank you, and thank you for having me speak today. I'm standing at the podium because it's hard for me to manage my papers. But I'm often asked to speak about my experience with Parkinson's disease because as a retired family physician, I've also lived with this disease now for 26 years, having been diagnosed at the age of 28. When Diane asked me to speak specifically about my experience as a woman with Parkinson's, I put pen to paper, so if you indulge me for a moment, I'll just like to read you what I wrote. I was never meant to tell this story. I wake to a body that whispers its own language. I wait for that whisper to slowly grow into a loud thunder, as my body begins its own story, a story I was never meant to tell. A story of dreams lost, the trajectory changed, where resilience and strength is crucial when facing an enemy that is ever present, pervasive, unrelenting. I was never meant to tell this story. One where even the simplest tasks become monumental challenges as my body takes on a life of its own, and pain and exhaustion are the outcome. I was never meant to tell this story. Mine was to be a physical strength, invincibility, not a story of my watching my abilities fade, having to fight an unyielding opponent in order to take care of my family, house, and home. I was never meant to tell the story. Mine was to be a super mom with boundless energy and time, not a story where I go from being their shelter to potentially their burden. The challenges that they may face, limitations that inevitably arise, where they must learn the hard lesson that life is not perfect and the ending at times unpredictable. I was never meant to tell this story. Mine was to be the life of a physician, to serve and heal others, never expecting to have a career lost, a calling that I loved taken away, where my years of training and devotion to my patients would end, where I would have to search for my new meaning, where I was the one that needed to be healed. I was never meant to tell this story, a story where I questioned how I appear to others, a story where I questioned my self-image, my womanhood, where confidence is lost to what this disease looks like, and self-esteem is replaced with self-doubt. Yes, this may be a story I was never meant to tell, yet here I am, a woman with an old man's disease, part of a global community, but also a sisterhood, fighting to change my story, fighting to change our story. One that we can author on our own terms, advocating for change, replacing sorrow with hope, helplessness with determination, fragility with resilience, and yes, telling my story. So throughout my journey, thank you. Throughout my journey with Parkinson's disease, I've always wondered about the variability of this disease, the unique life experience that each of us have despite the common diagnosis. We all have our own sets of symptoms, our own way of approaching those symptoms, complications, response to treatment. We follow our own trajectory and have our own life experiences, which are influenced by many psychosocial factors and circumstances. These commonalities and differences can vary in terms of where you live, your age, and yes, of course, your gender. And where are those unique challenges that women with Parkinson's face? The next couple of illustrations are from a study or a paper I was involved with, written by Dr. Subramaniam, actually, who's here in 2022. Those unique challenges vary. It seems that women with PD, as Dr. Tanner had mentioned, seem to have more tremor, more levodopa-induced dyskinesia, restless leg syndrome, and experience an increase in certain non-motor symptoms such as anxiety, depression, sleep, pain, apathy. And studies have also shown that diagnosis women tend to have poorer health-related quality of life, more psychological distress, and self-reported disability. And what's more is that we hear from our community of women that the severity and impact of these symptoms vary according to their hormonal status, for example, through their menstrual cycle or before and during menopause. But there's simply a paucity of information, published data, and clinical studies. Despite the hard work of our research community, there's very little dedicated to this study of the impact of Parkinson's based on gender or gender on Parkinson's disease. So recognizing this unmet need, the Women in PD group of the PD Avengers, which for those of you that don't know is also called the Global Alliance to End Parkinson's Disease, and we're a patient-led, patient-created group of over 8,000 members across 103 countries and 150 organizational partners. So we partnered with our friends at Fox Insight, and under the guidance actually of Dr. Tanner as well, to develop and deploy a series of surveys exploring and gathering data about the life experience of women with this disease. And our goal was to gather a large data set on diagnosis, symptoms, medication efficacy and management, home and lifestyle choices, hormone replacement, et cetera. So to broaden our knowledge of what the disease burden is for women. And we have done just that. Our 2 completed surveys have garnered over 2,600 respondents, and the last one on pregnancy and childbirth is still open and has about 980 responses. So there's definitely an interest in this community of women to have their voices heard. And a couple things. The majority of premenopausal women found their Parkinson's symptoms significantly changed or worsened before and during menstruation. Their medications don't seem to be as effective or worse at controlling their symptoms the week prior to and during menses. It seems in premenopausal versus postmenopausal women, the motor experiences seem to be quite similar, but the non-motor experiences seem to be quite different. And most importantly, for most women, regardless of what reproductive life stage they are at, over 90% of respondents said their healthcare team didn't ask or suggest any change to management based on their menstrual cycle or hormonal status, menopausal status. And these are but a few examples. We were talking about issues that compromise quality of life. That's why the patient voice, and I'm so glad for it to be featured in this meeting. It's so important to take into consideration when deciding the direction of research and trying to meet the unmet needs of a community. Women experience this disease differently. That's just a fact, depending on where they are in their life cycle. And women with PD that are younger actually experience cyclical changes on a monthly basis. The purpose of this effort is to spark a movement. Oops, I went the wrong way. The purpose of this effort is to spark a movement towards research into gender or sex differences. There's a need for high-quality research to identify reliable gender-sensitive biomarkers and social markers, as well as develop treatments and guidelines that will work to more tailored clinical approaches to women with this disease, leading to improved quality of life for women with this disease, and a greater understanding of this disease itself, which would actually benefit the entire community. As I mentioned earlier, this disease is heterogeneous in terms of how it presents, and also the treatment is not a one-size-fits-all. The unique physiology, therapeutic efficacy, neurochemistry varies between men and women, and this in some way translates probably to all neurological diseases. This is a call to action, an opportunity for us as a community of stakeholders to listen, understand, and address those issues that women are facing. This is about making a change in the way we do things in order for women to live their best lives despite this disease. They say that the first step for change is listening. So please listen, for this is our story. Thank you for your attention.
Amazing. Hard to put my feelings into words. We have two people pictured here who are here in the room. Sue Dubman here, who was part of CPP when we launched, and Shafak Ali, who was with us in Vienna at the launch. And Katie and Derek were also with us in Vienna at the launch. So I'll start with you, Derek, by way of background to tell everyone about yourself. But Derek has been a pioneer with us in so many ways. Over the last 5 years, we've partnered with Derek and others on advancing digital health technologies that have really been transformed because we put the patient voice front and center, and that really came from the inspiration of Soania as well. So Derek, can you say a little bit about your vision around how digital tools can help address the gaps with women?
No, it's very hard to follow such an emotional and moving presentation from a patient perspective, but there's absolutely no doubt that when we're looking at treatment, we need to be looking at treating the lived experiences that people have. And I spent the first 15 years of my career really more thinking about treating biomarkers, right? And actually, the lesson I think of my 15 years or whatever in Alzheimer's drug development work was that actually we all want a treatment that stops in its track the progression of a disease. We can all aspire, and we should not aspire for something which is second rate, but we've got to be realistic, right? That the most likely things we're going to have are not going to be complete cures, complete solutions, complete preventions. And therefore, we have to be focused on what matters for the patients. I was involved in imaging for many, many years, and I moved into digital and wearables because that got us so much closer to the lived experience. We could actually find out about what people's lives were, and one of the things that I found so fascinating in my work in digital has been the ability to collect data from people and show it back to the patients, and then say, yes, that captures what matters about my experience. And it feels to me that what I hear so loud and clear from this patient-led initiative in GenPD is that, but you've not been listening to us as women. We've not been getting the data, and that one of the most compelling things I heard from some patients that I interacted with digital in another disease, not Parkinson's, was that having this data helped them explain to their physicians what they'd been telling their physicians all along was how they felt, but they didn't have any sort of objective evidence of that. And the idea that data could inform a conversation with your physician, leads naturally to the idea they should also inform the way we have our treatment strategies. So I think digital has the potential to give us new insights into real lived experiences, has to be absolutely collaborative. And I don't think digital on its own is enough. It has to be digital with patient voice, and that gives us the tool that we might use to help address this, this big gap, I think, that you've identified. And hopefully then when we get treatments, they will actually have a positive impact and that there's lessons that go beyond just women, of course. We have to, for everybody, we have to be looking at how we focus on what matters in their lived experiences and how we target our research on that.
Thank you, Derek. Hearing from Katie Kopil is also so inspiring. She's here in DC also for the Public Policy Forum on behalf of Advocates for Change in Parkinson's funding and research. And she's been inspirational to me on this journey. Can you share with us some reflections you've had first on the unmet needs of Parkinson's overall, and then how GEMPD can help fill the gaps for women?
Hi, everyone. I'm at the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's Research. Carly gave such a great overview of what Parkinson's is, and just to give you a sense of the impact, there's about 1 million people living with Parkinson's today in the US, about 90,000 getting diagnosed annually. This puts it at sort of this like inverse Goldilocks position that's not as big as Alzheimer's to be a large market opportunity. It's not as small as rare diseases that might get orphan protections, and so we are constantly fighting to raise the importance of the needs of people like Soania, Sue, and others that are living with Parkinson's disease to make sure that industry can see that there's paths forward to getting these treatments to people that really want transformation. I want to draw on a couple of themes that Dr. Tanner and Dr. Mathur, because you are also a doctor, called out. Unmet need in Parkinson's disease is dependent on where somebody is in their journey. The constellation of symptoms that people present with are going to be different, and so not that you're developing drugs, you as sponsors are developing drugs as a one-size-fits-all approach, but understanding what matters to the patients and being able to, at the risk of misquoting Dr. Campbell, while Dr. Campbell's in the room, like, have you thought about measuring that? You should really dive deep into understanding what is meaningful to people with Parkinson's, and you should do that both at a global level, understanding what the Parkinson's patient population at large considers to be meaningful, and tools like Fox Insight are a great way to collect a lot of data from a lot of people quickly, but also where somebody is in that journey and their preferences and their risk-benefit appetite and what matters to them is going to shift across the continuum of disease. There are certainly aspects of a movement disorder, something that gets diagnosed based on somebody's motor features that are not captured under the heading of a movement disorder, and I think both Dr. Tanner and Dr. Mathur highlighted a lot of these non-motor aspects of disease that are really critical to people with Parkinson's. There was a study a few years ago organized by Medical Device Innovation Consortium with support from CDRH, people with Parkinson's, and executed by the team at RTI Health Solutions that looked at patient preference for type 1 versus type 2 error in a hypothetical neuromodulation trial. It kind of looks and sounds like DBS, but they didn't call it that. And you understand that risk that people are willing to take for a benefit on cognitive outcomes was much higher than for benefits on motor because there are already available motor therapies. And so it's not just where somebody is in the continuum of their disease what's important, but it's also what's the standard of care that is available today. And so I think it's really critical to understand that while called a movement disorder, that Parkinson's is multi-symptom, multi-domain disorder. And to put a spotlight on GEMPD, people are always saying, and I have also learned from Dr. Campbell, that Parkinson's is not as heterogeneous as other disorders. And so you have a sense of the trajectory, but as sponsors in the room, you all want to reduce heterogeneity in your trials. You want to be able to understand who are you enrolling? Are you enrolling the right people that are going to respond the right way? And you not collecting data on sex, biologic fluctuations adds a variability to your data that you are not yet accounting for. And so I encourage an opportunity to work and partner with nonprofit organizations in your disease area to understand what matters to patients, to make sure you're capturing that in your clinical trials, and also to understand, as a perimenopausal woman, I might not be having my best day. I hope I was better yesterday advocating on the Hill. This is just how life is. And so if you're showing up on your best day on visit 1 and your worst day on your final visit, that's not that great for your clinical trial readout as the sponsor in studying that participant. And so encouraging you to look at the data and collect the data, because if you don't collect it, you cannot analyze it in this way. The other piece, please do not be afraid to think of patient experiences as data. There is great science evolving to make patient experiences data, and this is where CPATH in general and CPP specifically have been so critical that you are able to gain new insights when you look at evidence as data and have a data-driven perspective. And so really thankful for CPP to take this on. Thank you on behalf of women. Thank you on behalf of the Parkinson's community. And thank you on behalf of sponsors who are going to be able to get better trial data when you understand what you should be measuring in the patients that you're recruiting for your trials.
Outstanding. Thank you so much, Katie. I'm going to ask just a few questions so we have plenty of time for Q&A. I'm going to ask a question to Dr. Tanner because I think this new publication that just came out this week is just one of many examples where we're finally seeing attention to sex differences. This new paper in Annals of Clinical and Translational Neurology titled Chronic Pain and Parkinson's Disease, Prevalence, Sex Differences, Regional Anatomy, and Comorbidities is based on evaluation of over 10,000 individuals in Australia. And lo and behold, they find that there is actually increased incidence of pain in Parkinson's in women versus men. To me, that's a shock. All the 25 years I've been working on Parkinson's, starting with Christine and primates, I was told, pain, that's not part of Parkinson's. That must be something different. So maybe you can just tell us, what does that mean to you, Carly, and how can we use things like the approach you've taken in Fox Insight to ask questions around things like pain that we thought were never part of Parkinson's?
Yeah, so I guess pain has been part of Parkinson's, but not something we can treat very well. So I think we've been aware of it, but like, you know, one of the huge gaps in therapy for Parkinson's is what we call the, quote, non-motor features, which, if you remember that diagram I showed, is most of the bubbles on that diagram, right? There are a few that are, quote, motor, the movement-related ones. The rest of them are non-motor, and we're not very good at treating most of them, right? Pain being one of them, and pain sometimes can happen well before the onset of the disease. I remember people saying, I felt like I had a toothache in my arm, and then later that was the side that was first affected with Parkinson's, but it's not well recognized, and I think that's an important factor, and I think this differences between men and women in all of these non-motor features are relevant because they are usually different. And in general, when you look at sort of the one or two studies that have really tried to systematically study this, you see more of many non-motor symptoms being reported in women than men. Is that because there are more? Or is that because women describe things differently or are more likely to report? We don't even know, right? So I think one of the big gaps is most of these, there's one study, right? Or two studies. We don't have a good body of evidence that even breaks things down so that you can see these are the women, these are the men. You can't pull multiple studies and look at the women in 6 studies and say how do they compare to the men in those 6 studies, because sex isn't always reported. Right. And so you can't break it down. The second is we don't know if it's women are more likely to say they have pain than men, or it's because women really have more pain than men. So I think that's the next level. And then how do you look at the biology? Because I think that's the most important thing is, you know, actually design studies, design trials so that you can really start characterizing the differences and then explore them in people and in the laboratory.
Data tells the way. Perfect. Sonia, I'm going to ask you a question that might be a little challenging, but in your view of what success looks like, if you were to look 3 years from today, what would be inspiring or telling you that people are listening? What would you like to see happen for a trial designed only in women or subtype analysis from a trial that read out say, hey, we're seeing differences in women? Tell us what success looks like in your view.
I think that the development of some sort of management guidelines would be a success. I don't know whether that can be done in 3 years, but first that has to start off with listening to women, documenting what they're saying, looking at the lived experience of women in terms of their life stage. I think that's important. And also mining the data that we already have as well. That could be very, I don't know, easily done, but that could be done. And I think we might already see some trends that maybe we have not yet discovered. Certainly encouraging clinical trial researchers to pay attention to gender differences in their studies, I think is important. But yeah, success would be improved quality of life ultimately for women with PD. But
Urgency.
yeah, the urgency.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Katie for a moment because one of the most rewarding parts of my entire career was partnering with Katie and the entire community globally to lay out this framework around biologic staging of Parkinson's that has personal meaning to me. Thinking all along, for the diseases that hit my family, Parkinson's and Lewy body dementia, were historically thought as two different diseases, but lo and behold, a common biomarker brings them together. Katie, can you reflect a little bit on the journey of what you and the foundation did to really rally all the different stakeholders together to put together a framework that is still wheels in motion, but clearly setting the stage for the future?
Yeah, a lot of this is listening to what FDA had been saying, that you are treating a clinical syndrome with a biological approach, but you're not enrolling people based on biology. This seems set up for failure from the get-go. And so the opportunity to even put in place a framework before you have biological tools to measure in living people what's happening, that you should be thinking about the treatment goals that you want to advance. And so we were at a moment in time several years ago, I've lost sense of time, but maybe 2023, there were new biomarker tools that were being advanced for Parkinson's disease. There was the call to action from the regulators to think about diseases biologically. And then I think what is always consistent is the treatment goals. It doesn't matter what tools are going to evolve, but the idea that you maybe want to stop a disease before the onset of symptoms. You want to prevent the worsening of symptoms, any onset of to functional impairment, or prevent bad outcomes down the road. And so the opportunity to think holistically with drug developers, with clinicians, I would say research clinicians that are very forward-thinking, research clinicians, input from current and former regulators to think about how would this actually be put into practice in clinical trial design, nonprofit organizations like CPATH and the Fox Foundation, and with patients, to put together a framework that we know is going to iterate and evolve, but we want to start developing evidence in a consistent way to think about how do you define the right patients for the right trials, define the eligibility criteria that way, and then look at, in a progressive disease, progression that matters and is meaningful to patients. And I think this is a template. If you were in a field that doesn't have these tools to do this yet, just start. Sometimes you can be emboldened by not realizing how hard it is, and that's probably where the Fox Foundation was. And in fact, when you think back to the patient voice, the people that understand it, the staging framework the most, are people that are trained as biologists, clinicians, scientists, and patients, because they think, yes, of course, my disease experience is different, and I think about staging in lots of different other areas of health, just not my Parkinson's disease. And I think this is an opportunity to also consider sex as a biologic factor and think about ways to incorporate this into the design of frameworks, and think really about the ways to be generating data and sharing data so that the field at large could learn. I understand that there are all the reasons not to do this, but CPATH is a great advocate and a great repository for centralizing the insights that can be generated through well-designed informative clinical trials. And I'm excited to see GEMPD become part of that ecosystem alongside this biologic framework for thinking about different clinically defined conditions in a biologic lens.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask one more question to Derek, and then we'll open it up. So Derek was with us in Vienna, and one of the most eye-opening learnings from that meeting was we got into a discussion around digital twins, and we are witnessing, this is very exciting, right? We started this whole conference off on this idea of N-of-1 individualized treatments. To our surprise, it was the 5 women living with Parkinson's that were completely jazzed about the idea of digital twins. Can you reflect a little bit on that conversation and how you might think that we could materialize something using the work you're doing with us on digital technologies?
Yes. So I think the GenPD project emphasizes that we are short of data, right? We lack data, at least data that's readily available to use. And that the problem with machine learning, AI, a lot of the digital twin underlying methodology is it's very, very data hungry. So the first thing to say is that the fact that we're all here is partly because we've got gaps in the data, and those gaps prevent us building the model that will enable us to have an ideal digital twin. But, and this is where I think there's a big but, we can look at the data we've got. And this is something that we are doing together, and GEMPD has helped us do this. We're looking at things like the Watch BD data and the Blue Sky data that was originally a Pfizer study that was shared with CPATH, and looking at signals related to sex in that data. What comes out, can it help us generate hypotheses? But we're going to need a lot more data. And this is, I think, where collectively we can say, how can we collect the sort of data we might need to build the models that might enable us to get to the place where we can actually have a model of natural history of disease adapted, customized to the individual woman who's got Parkinson's. And then, obviously we then got somebody on treatment, and we're seeing how that treatment responds, and we compare, if you like, the treatment response to that digital twin, not some generic and perhaps unrepresentative model of what progression should be. It's a fantastic aspiration, but we need to think a lot, how do we get the data? And I think the FDA has been extremely forward-looking in things like their guidance on credibility assessments and modelling and simulation. They're giving us the regulatory tools to help us go in that direction, so it's good time. It's a good time to do this.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So we are plenty happy to hear questions or comments from folks here in the room. This is Sue Devman, again, our heroes. By way of background, Sue wrote with me 10 years ago a whole perspective published in Journal of Parkinson's called Why Data Sharing is Critical.
Yeah, just to comment on the data and the importance of data is that there was a sign hanging in the FDA that used to say, "In God we trust, all else bring data." I had a comment about the differences between men and women. One of the things that I see, and I live in a 55-plus community, is that it seems like a major differentiator is whether you're a veteran or not a veteran. Because veterans they were exposed to Agent Orange, they were exposed to chemicals that maybe women were not exposed to if they weren't, if they weren't in the service. And I think that would be a good thing to look at is the difference between men and women when you take the effect of the military service out of the analysis. Just a thought.
Thank you, Sue. I think Carly Tanner is perfect to answer that. You've been doing work in the VA for quite some time.
I have been, so I have done a lot of work looking at the exposures to environmental toxicants and Parkinson's risk, pesticides, Agent Orange, herbicides, related agents. It's another area where there's relatively little data on women because, especially in the older era, there were not as many women who were exposed in service. That's changing a little bit, and we have maybe some preliminary studies. We're collaborating with some people to look at people from the Gulf War era forward, but it's sort of too soon to tell in that population. I will say one of the slides I had to pull out was a report from a study that we did in another population-based cohort called the Agricultural Health Study, which is a study of farmers and their wives who were pesticide applicators living in 2 states, Iowa and North Carolina, set up originally to study cancer outcomes, and we tagged on for Parkinson's. And what we found was that a pesticide called rotenone, which blocks a specific activity in the cell in the area called the mitochondria that we think may be related to some Parkinson's pathogenesis, was associated with Parkinson's overall, but the risk was greater in women, and even though women had longer durations of exposure, et cetera, right? So, there seems to be a difference in sex difference between men and women, and there's a laboratory study that also replicated that got us looking at that. So it looks like toxicant exposure as well as drug response may have sex-mediated factors that we mostly haven't looked at, right?
Thank you, Sue. I see we have Bola Grace, another champion for women's health I met at the Roche Digital Biomarker meeting in June. Love to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Diane, and thanks to all the panelists. As Diane says, I'm Bola Grace. I'm from University College London and GSK.
Could you speak up a little bit more?
Oh, okay, sorry. I tend to speak very fast.
Okay.
I will slow down. I'm absolutely fascinated by everything being discussed. As you know, I'm passionate about this. Earlier, Derek was talking about the promise of digital health technologies. I'm a big advocate and proponent, as you know. But this morning, in the patient-centered session, we're talking about, one of the panelists was talking about actually not everybody is excited about decentralized trials. And I remember making a note, must investigate further, because, you know, if you work in your little silo, of course, everything is better being remote, and it's cheaper, and it's faster, and we have all these data sets. And some of the feedback that we've been getting is that digital health technologies in themselves can be ableist, and in some cases, exacerbate those health inequities or, you know, limit inclusion. I was wondering, Soania, Catherine, has this been your experience? Have you heard the same stories or sentiments? And somebody is raising their hand to say, yes, I've heard that story and sentiment. Right.
Sorry. Hi, yeah, because I'm Shafak. Hello, everybody. Person with Parkinson's, dentist. Sorry, I'll start again. I'm Shafak. I'm a person with Parkinson's, and I'm from England, and a dentist. Yeah, I'm working with Parkinson's UK because we do find that this is indeed the case. It is very much discriminatory against those from lower socioeconomic groups,
Yes.
Less education, and those who are scared of technology. And we are very much looking into how we can overcome, educate, integrate, and include those who are being sidelined, marginalised by this. So it is on people's agenda, but you are absolutely right to champion it, and we need to shout it out louder because everybody needs to understand that not everyone is online or comfortable being online.
Thank you. We must connect.
Yeah, we must. I was actually going to ask you a card.
Smitty, great to see you.
Great to see you, Diane. Smitty Hevner, I'm CPAT's Senior Scientific Director for Real World Evidence. Building on Dr. Grace's question about data limitations and being somewhat selfish about my own goals, Diane, you and I have spent the last year talking about where real world evidence and real world data might fit into GEMPD. And I want to specifically pick Dr. Mathur and Dr. Tanner's brains about the limitations of real-world data for Parkinson's, women with Parkinson's. Dr. Tanner, you pointed out this morning what I think is probably the most important limitation, specifically of EHR data, in that this is a billing platform, and the goal of the collection, the curation, the storage of that data is to make sure we're properly reimbursed. But for any successful real-world data application, we need to truly understand all the limitations of the data we're using so that we don't make improper conclusions. And so my question specifically to the two of you, but also to the rest of the panel, of course, given your expertise, is what, if any, unique considerations do we need to think about as we use real-world data to try to understand the progression, the natural history, the effective treatments, or the unmet needs for women with Parkinson's?
Wow. So I guess, you know, some of the things have to do with just making sure we have sufficient and adequate data to represent women. And right now that I think is still a gap, that we don't have enough data to really be able to reflect the experience and the possible heterogeneity of women's experience and, you know, sort of across the lifespan. So to me, that's probably the biggest gap. Reporting sex in being able to look at data and taking that into account, I think, is something we don't do routinely and should do, right? Then there are many layers beyond that. I won't go into super detail because I want Soania to speak as well, but yeah.
I kind of go back to that saying where anything that can be measured isn't necessarily, anything that can be measured is not necessarily, oh my goodness. Anything that is, oh, I'm sorry, I just lost that thought. basically, we're not necessarily measuring what is impactful for women based on their experience. And women differ in terms of, the stage of life they're at, the stage of disease, et cetera. So are we actually measuring the real life experience that can be compared amongst women? And that's really what I'm thinking. I can't remember.
Highlighting a gap in the real world evidence.
Yeah.
Exactly.
If you collect certain things, you may or may not find what you're looking for depending on what was asked. And I think this is a key piece. A lot of classic Parkinson's studies look at motor symptoms. And so to ask people with Parkinson's about their non-motor symptoms, we need to start incorporating that into assessments, and that might not be so easy with digital measures, at least if you're looking passively.
I see we're just about out of time. I just want to thank everyone.
Can I say something real quick? Sorry.
Yes, oh, sure, certainly, real
So
quick.
my name is Indu Subramanian. I wrote the paper with Sonia and 3
Oh,
other women
congratulations.
living with Parkinson's. And we did actually put pain up there in our diagram. So I think, just having real world experience writing papers with patients is it's actually an amazing thing to learn, and also a lot of barriers to be able to publish around that, because a lot of the times we put quotes from patients, and I think just academia is not set up to include the patient voice, and I think we really have to advocate for that. Additionally, on the point about real world live, what we found was that if you don't ask women specifically, they're not going to tell you. And I think a lot of the times women don't complain. They're just taught to kind of grin and bear it, especially women of color, younger women who are moms and, just trying to get through the appointment and go home and deal with their, myriad domestic duties. So we really have to design ways to bring out these things and take the time to hear what the women are talking about. Additionally, I think the word stigma has not been used in this session, but stigma is huge. And Sonia's herself published in this space around shame and blame. And so when you have a disease that's so stigmatizing and you don't look like the image, it becomes one of these things where people just don't come forward to even get diagnosed. They explain away the symptoms. Often if the doctor doesn't ask them, they don't think they're important enough to bring up. And then, so the whole data is very skewed. So we really have to think about, getting back to basics of like redesigning even the patient visit to understand kind of the lived experience. And I'm a doctor, so I'll take some of that blame.
Thank you for your advocacy. I followed your work, and I want to say that CPP is very proud. We have 6 publications co-authored with people living with Parkinson's, some of which with FDA as well. So fantastic session. We're really excited about next steps, and please let us know how you can give us more data.